My brother hid Grandpa's final letter so he could keep everything, then my lawyer found. The notice of eviction arrived on a Thursday. I know this because Thursday is the day I mill kiln-dried American walnut. And the shop was thick with the rich, peppery smell of sawdust when I heard the heavy staple gun fire against my front door. It was 2:15 in the afternoon. I shut down the planer, brushed the dust off my flannel shirt, and walked to the entrance. Taped to the frosted glass was a bright yellow sheet of legal paper. It gave me 30 days to vacate the premises of Callahan Custom Millworks, a property I had managed, bled for, and kept profitable for the last 10 years. The landlord listed on the notice wasn't my grandfather, who had owned the building since 1982. It was a Delaware-registered entity called Apex Development LLC. I didn't need to look up the corporate registration to know who owned Apex. My older brother, Julian, had been talking about the untapped spatial value of my shop's zip code since the neighborhood started gentrifying 5 years ago. I didn't rip the notice down in a rage. I didn't call Julian to scream into the receiver. I carefully removed the staples with my Leatherman, placed the notice in a manila folder, washed my hands, and dialed my attorney. If you spend enough time working with heavy machinery, you learn a fundamental truth. Panic is what gets your fingers cut off. When the blade is spinning, you keep your hands steady, you watch the angles, and you follow the procedure. I was about to apply that same arithmetic to my brother. Julian and I grew up in the same house, but we existed in different economies. Julian was a finance guy, the kind of Manhattan private equity vice president who wears a fleece vest indoors and views every human interaction as a leveraged buyout. I was a carpenter. When Julian left for the East Coast, I stayed in Ohio. I learned the trade from our grandfather, Arthur. Arthur was a man whose hands looked like tan leather and who spoke entirely in actions. When my father died, Arthur became our anchor. But as Arthur got older, his heart began to fail, and the heavy lifting at the millworks transferred to me. I ran the payroll. I managed the supply chains. I kept the lights on. Julian sent expensive scotch at Christmas and called twice a year to ask if Arthur had considered selling the land the shop sat on to maximize his portfolio. Arthur died in his sleep early this past January. He was 82. Julian flew in for the funeral, wearing a bespoke suit, looking somber for the relatives, and acting as the official master of ceremonies. 2 days after we put the old man in the ground, Julian asked for the combination to Arthur's floor safe in the home office. As the eldest, and the named executor in a will Arthur had drafted back in 2008, Julian felt entitled to take inventory immediately. I was sitting in the hallway, sorting through sympathy cards, when I saw it happen. The safe door swung open. Julian reached in and pulled out a stack of documents. On top was a sealed, handwritten envelope with my name on it. I watched my brother's eyes scan the handwriting. I watched his jaw tighten. And then, with the practiced smoothness of a man who makes his living shifting numbers, he slipped my letter into his inner jacket pocket. He left the rest of the documents in the safe. He thought I didn't see him. I didn't say a word. I knew exactly what Julian assumed that letter was. In the months before his death, Arthur and I had been working closely. Julian, paranoid about missing out on a windfall, had convinced himself that Arthur was writing a codicil, a legal amendment to his old 2008 will, that would split the estate evenly or give the lucrative commercial property of the millworks entirely to me. By making that letter disappear, Julian believed he was securing the original 2008 will, which left the entirety of Arthur's estate to his responsible older grandson. For the next 4 months, Julian moved through the probate courts with the aggressive speed of a corporate raider. He hired an expensive estate firm, fast-tracked the probate filings, and formally accepted his role as executor and sole beneficiary of Arthur's estate. He signed the paperwork accepting the assets as is. He didn't ask me for anything, and I didn't offer anything. I just kept cutting wood and filling custom cabinetry orders. Then came the Thursday in May. The eviction notice. The final step in his plan to bulldoze my livelihood and build luxury condos. I took the yellow paper to Sarah Vance. Sarah is a corporate and environmental attorney who doesn't use big words to sound smart. She uses them to be precise. I sat across from her mahogany desk and slid the folder over. She read the eviction notice, then looked at me over the rim of her glasses. Your brother filed this through his LLC, assuming he inherited the commercial deed through probate, Sarah said, her voice dry. He's been trying to serve this for a week, but the county clerk's system is backed up. Can he evict me? I asked. Sarah smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of an apex predator looking at a wounded gazelle. No. Because your brother doesn't own your shop. He never did. And the probate court never had jurisdiction over it. She opened a thick binder on her desk. 5 years ago, when the neighborhood started turning, Arthur came to see me. He knew Julian was eyeing the property. He also knew Julian thought you were just a hired hand. Arthur didn't write a new will. Wills have to go through probate, where they become public record and can be contested by angry relatives. Instead, Arthur and I executed an irrevocable trust. She slid a document toward me. Arthur transferred the deed of the millworks, the building, the equipment, and the business accounts entirely into the Callahan Legacy Trust in 2019. You are the sole trustee and the sole beneficiary. The property exited his personal estate 5 years ago, when Julian submitted that 2008 will to the probate court. Claiming everything Arthur owned, this shop was no longer legally his to claim. I looked at the signatures. There was Arthur's sharp, angular cursive next to the notary stamp. He had protected me, quietly and completely, half a decade before he died. So, Julian's eviction notice is useless, I said, leaning back. It's worse than useless. It's legally frivolous, Sarah replied. But that's not the interesting part. Do you know what was actually left in Arthur's personal estate? The estate your brother just rushed through probate to claim total ownership of? I frowned. His house? His car? Arthur sold the house to pay for his home care nurses, Sarah corrected. No. The only real property left in Arthur's name at the time of his death was a 12-acre industrial parcel out in a neighboring county. He bought it at a tax auction in 1995. Hoping to expand the millworks, but never developed it. The old chemical plant lot, I remembered. It's a wasteland. Fenced off. Why is that interesting? Sarah turned to the next page in her binder. It was a letterhead from the United States Environmental Protection Agency. Because in the 1980s, the previous owners of that lot illegally dumped thousands of gallons of industrial solvents into the soil. The EPA caught wind of it 2 years ago. They designated the property a Superfund site. They assessed a mandatory environmental cleanup lien on the land. She paused, letting the silence stretch in the office before delivering the final blow. The cleanup cost is estimated at $3.2 million. Federal liens attached to the property. As the owner of the property, Arthur was liable. But Arthur is dead. I stared at her, the pieces clicking together with the heavy, undeniable weight of a closing vault door. Julian accepted the estate. Julian accepted the estate, Sarah confirmed, nodding slowly. When you inherit property, you have the legal right to execute a disclaimer of interest, basically telling the government, no thank you, I don't want this. And walking away from the liability. But Julian didn't do his due diligence. He was so terrified that you might get a piece of the pie, so desperate to lock down what he thought was the millworks, that he rushed the probate and signed the acceptance of the estate in its entirety. By doing so, Julian just personally assumed a $3.2 million federal environmental liability. I thought back to the day of the funeral. The safe. The envelope with my name on it that Julian had stolen and hidden. Sarah, I asked quietly. Did Arthur write me a letter before he died? He did, she said softly. He told me he put it in a safe. It wasn't a codicil. It was a warning. He wrote a letter to you, explaining the EPA lien on the old chemical lot. He explicitly detailed the steps you needed to take to legally disclaim the inheritance so the federal government wouldn't bankrupt you. He trusted that if Julian tried to take everything, Julian would find the letter, assume it was about money, and hide it from you. Thus, hiding the warning from himself. I sat in the leather chair, feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of awe for the man who had taught me how to measure twice and cut once. Arthur had built a trap out of nothing but my brother's own greed. 3 weeks later, Sarah arranged a mediation meeting at her firm. Julian walked into the conference room flanked by a sleek, overpriced attorney in a tailored suit. Julian looked impatient, checking his Rolex as he sat down. He didn't look at me. Let's make this quick, Julian's lawyer started, opening his briefcase. My client is the sole executor and heir to the Callahan estate. We've issued a 30-day notice to vacate the commercial property currently occupied by the millworks. We are willing to offer a $10,000 relocation stipend if your client vacates peacefully by the end of the week. Otherwise, we file an unlawful detainer suit tomorrow morning. Sarah didn't open a briefcase. She just slid a single folder across the polished table. You can't evict someone from a property you don't own, Sarah said simply. The millworks was transferred into an irrevocable trust 5 years ago. My client is the trustee. It is completely insulated from the probate estate. I've included the recorded deed in the trust documents. You'll find them in order. Julian's lawyer stopped. He picked up the documents, his eyes scanning the legal jargon. I watched the color drain from his face as he realized Sarah wasn't bluffing. He leaned over and whispered something into Julian's ear. That's impossible, Julian snapped, finally looking at me. His veneer of corporate superiority cracking. He left everything to me in the will. I probated the estate. You did, I said, speaking for the first time. My voice was calm, anchored in the reality of the room. You claimed everything that was left. Tell me, Julian. When you opened Arthur's safe after the funeral, did you find a letter with my name on it? Julian froze. He swallowed hard. I don't know what you're talking about. You took it. You hid it because you thought Arthur was giving me half his money, I said. Leaning forward, resting my forearms on the table. If you had actually opened it and read it, you would have seen that Arthur wasn't giving me anything. He was warning me. Sarah slid a second document across the table. The EPA Superfund assessment. Congratulations on your inheritance, Julian, Sarah said, her tone clinical and devoid of mercy. By rushing to accept the entirety of the estate without a standard environmental assessment, and by bypassing the disclaimer period, you are now the proud owner of a toxic waste site. The EPA's cleanup lien is just over $3 million. Since you signed the probate acceptance individually, they will pierce your LLC to collect. They will garnish your wages, liquidate your private equity shares, and attach liens to your Manhattan apartment until the soil in Ohio is clean. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the sound of a man realizing he had jumped out of an airplane only to discover his parachute was an anvil. Julian looked at the EPA document. His hands started to shake. He looked at his lawyer, who was already subtly leaning away from him, mentally calculating how fast he could drop him as a client. Julian looked at me, his eyes wide, pleading for the first time in his life. We're brothers. You have the shop. It's making money. You have to help me with this. I looked at him. I saw the kid who used to break my toys and lie to our parents about it. I saw the man who had smiled at relatives at a funeral while planning to throw me onto the street. I'm a carpenter, Julian, I said softly, standing up and buttoning my jacket. I fix things made of wood. I can't fix a federal environmental liability. You should have read the fine print. I walked out of the office and left him sitting there in the quiet. The fallout was predictable and devastating. The EPA does not negotiate when it comes to Superfund sites. Julian tried to fight it in federal court, burning through his savings to pay retainer fees. He lost. He was forced to declare personal bankruptcy a year later to restructure the debt, losing his job at the private equity firm when his financial standing collapsed. His condo in Manhattan was seized and sold. I kept the shop. I expanded the floor space, hired 2 new apprentices, and kept making custom cabinets. In my office, right next to the design drafts, I have a small, framed piece of kiln-dried American walnut. On it, engraved in gold, is a quote I remember Arthur telling me when I was 16 years old. Struggling to cut a straight line on the bandsaw. If you try to force the wood, it will kick back and break you. Let the blade do the work. My brother tried to force the world to give him everything. I just stood back, stayed quiet, and let the law do the work.